It starts with my grandfather telling his life sort of until the war and after the war, leaving those 4 years sort of like as an empty window, because that was the empty window in his life. Then it explores all the different characters I met along the way, dozens of people who I've spoken to. And then it wraps up at the end with those 4 years, with the reveal of what happened there, why was it so significant. I think that after October 7th, a lot of these assumptions, I don't think they crashed, but we were shaken a little bit. We're taken back to the same kind of insecurities we had in the 1940s.
Hello and welcome to the ILTV Podcast. I'm Aron Hoffman, Executive Editor of ILTV, and we are so happy to welcome back our viewers and our listeners. Today I brought in a guest who is a former journalist and a very strong new author, the author of Zaidy's Bands. Welcome, Aron Heller.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's good to be here.
Great. So, Aron, I want to first start out. You have this book, Zaidy's Band. It's your first book.
Yep.
Tell me, what led you to write this book?
Well, I guess the genesis of it is it's a lifelong project. I mean, basically, ever since I was a little kid, I knew that my grandfather had served in World War II. There was even a picture of him in his wedding photo. He was with uniform. But that was all we knew. We couldn't talk about it. It was sort of a taboo thing. It was the greatest generation who liked to be the strong, silent types. And as you know, I'm a journalist and I'm inquisitive and interested. And all my life I sort of tried to get at it. And he never would budge. He never would talk about it. And I left it eventually. And then I became a journalist and discovered that I had this ability to talk to people and get really good stories out of them. And I did dozens about Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans. And right when he was about to turn 90, I said, you know what, I got to get back to this. I mean, this is my grandfather. I've done it with dozens of other people. And that's how our journey began, really, when it was about his 90th birthday. And then that sort of kicked off a 10, 11-year journey where I took 8 trips from Israel to Toronto and countless calls and messages in between. And that was the genesis of this, and it evolved into a bigger exploration of the whole theme of Jews fighting in World War II.
And you say Toronto because I'm assuming you're from Toronto.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was born in Boston, but my family's from Toronto. Both my parents are from Toronto, and the entire extended family is there. So it sort of opened up a window into sort of like an unknown part. Also the personal journey of discovering what it was in him, but what he represented also as far as Canadian Jewish soldiers and Jewish soldiers in a wider sense.
Which I'm sure is what people are going to be able to read about in the book. I mean, I would like you to tell me a little bit about the plot and the characters. Bring me into the story. Give me a little bit of history. What are we reading?
Well, we're reading basically a story that explores the larger issue of the Jewish soldiers in World War II. And it's surprising to me because I also came across, it's not something we grew up on, not in Israel, not in the diaspora. When people think about World War II and the Jewish experience, the immediate association is the Holocaust, as it should be. 6 million Jews were killed. But there's a flip side to that. There's another story, and that is 1.5 million Jews served in the various Allied. And every time I drop that stat, people are shocked by it because they have no idea.
It's a huge number.
It is a really big number, and that includes the Red Army and the Americans and the British and all the Allies. And every single place there was a battle in World War II, there were Jews involved in it, in every single front. And not only that, 250,000 of them died in battle.
Of the 1.5 million.
Yeah, and so people are like, they know about the victims of the camps and of the Nazis. These are soldiers who went down. So it sort of triggered in me a real interest to discover this. And like I said, it all starts with my grandfather, trying to get his story. And he was very difficult to get him to open up. But slowly, it sort of peeled like the onion every time. And it began through an exploration of his friends. And as it turns out, one of his best friends was a real bona fide World War II hero. And I discovered his story and wrote about that and published his story throughout these years in various magazines. And then afterwards, through that, it opened up this new window to the volunteers who came to Israel. And that was the Mahal volunteers, who another unknown legacy of the 48 war, the huge impact that the foreign volunteers had. And so, like I said, it started out on a personal angle, and it just widened out to something larger. And I think the connecting theme is my grandfather's story and these overlooked elements of Jewish history.
And I'm assuming that in the book there's a combination of the personal, the narrative of your grandfather, then kind of building out with the narrative, as you described, with the history up until, the end of the story.
Exactly. It starts with my grandfather telling his life sort of until the war and after the war, leaving those 4 years sort of like as an empty window, because that was the empty window in his life. Then it explores all the different characters I met along the way, dozens of people who I've spoken to. And then it wraps up at the end with those 4 years, with the reveal of what happened there, why was it so significant, and how did it leave this shadow for his life and for so many others.
And the book's very relevant today because, I mean, we're going through kind of an existential threat regarding the rise in anti-Semitism, the October 7th massacre, which, of course, is the largest, massacre into Jews since the Holocaust. Tell me, we've talked a little bit beforehand, and you were talking about how some of the lessons that you learned in writing this book really apply today and that we could all learn from it as well. Can you share some of those ideas?
Sure. And it's interesting how it evolved into that because, like I said, I started on this in 2011, and most of the manuscript was written long before October 7th. Wow. And so I initially started looking at this really as just like an ode to history. But you know how sort of like life takes over, and somehow in the last 2 years when I was wrapping up the book, I've all of a sudden discovered all these parallels that are happening. And the main one, I think, is that really, we've lived for the last 80 years, more or less, in, I think, an unprecedented time in Jewish history, in the sense that we've had a Jewish homeland and we've been relatively secure here. There's always been terrorism and wars, but at least since 73, we haven't really had an existential threat. And
Iran, I would say, might be considered an existential threat.
But until recent years, like when I grew up, like when I came of age in the 80s and 90s, we had this sense of like, oh, Israel's a given.
Yeah.
And same thing with the diaspora. There was this feeling that, there's a little anti-Semitism here and there, but we're prospering and we're living freely. And I think that after October 7th, a lot of these assumptions, I don't think they crashed, but they were shaken a little bit. We're taken back to the same kind of insecurity as we had in the 1940s. And as I mentioned in the prologue to the book, I say, when I've had difficult times as an Israeli, as a Jew, as a Zionist, I've often looked back at these stories for inspiration to see that while this might be unprecedented in our lifetime, it's not unprecedented in Jewish history, and we are standing on the shoulders of giants who have been through this and worse and persevered. So I think in that sense it's inspiring.
Sure. I mean, and it's interesting that you're talking about, this idea that we can look back and say that history is cyclical, that if we will look at history, we will actually learn and maybe even be able to predict somewhat what is going to, not that we could have predicted October 7th itself, but certainly that Jews won't always be comfortable, for example, in North America potentially, because most places that Jews become too comfortable eventually, they're not. And we're seeing that today. And I'm very interested to see how the book parallels this. Talk to me a little bit about how it, though, impacted your own family personally. I mean, you mentioned you started this 10, 11 years ago. I'm assuming in order to get your grandfather to talk, you had to maybe work with the grandmother, talk to your parents. I don't know. How did this all work out for you? And also to leave your young kids, to leave Israel, to travel to Toronto so many times in order to get these stories?
Well, first of all, sometimes they came with me. It was family trips as well. But look, it wasn't easy because, as you know, I'm a journalist, so that's my nature. But when it's your own family, it's much more difficult.
Well, you don't want to ask those leading, pressing questions, maybe.
Well, I mean, I've sort of, I've done it so long that I know how to ask the questions. I know how to get the stories out of people. Mm-hmm. But when it's your own family, it's far more different because you know the sensitivities more, and you know where you can tread and where you can't, and you don't have that impartiality that you have when you're doing a story about someone who you're not necessarily as familiar with. And in this case, it was very difficult because there was a lot of resistance. And so I was constantly battling with myself within how much do I press him to try to get him to open up? How much do I leave it alone, as everybody suggested I did? But I think that's where sort of like the journalist instincts came in a little bit, because I had a sense throughout that he wanted somehow to get it out. He just didn't really know how to. And we sort of had to wait for him. And so when I set out on this, I set one goal to myself. I said, I'm going to only take him as far as he's willing to go. I'm going to give him the options. I gave him, all the forms to fill out to get his records and all these kind of things. And most of the time he rejected them. But as the time went on, he saw the stories I was doing regardless. And he kept on commenting all the time. Every article I wrote for the Associated Press about Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans. And then he would chip in, and it was like this approach avoidance kind of thing. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, I'd come to him and he'd shut down. And then when I'd relent, he'd come to me with stories about some friends of his. And so that sort of was like this delicate dance, I call it. And I mean, it was very satisfying both professionally, but also, I feel like we got closer than we ever had before through that process.
Why was he so resistant? Did you ever find out why he really shut down so much? And for 90 years, or not 90, but 60 years or some odd plus, 7 years didn't share the story?
Well, he had his own reasons, personal reasons, but I think he also reflected generally the attitude of World War II veterans. And, we're Generation X. Our parents are the boomers. They're the greatest generation. It's a different kind of mindset. I think he was actually, I find him to be more emblematic of the rest of them rather than different, in the sense that they just went out there, they did what they had to do, they came back, and then they were like, I'm out of this, I'm done, I'm moving on with my life, I'm not looking back. Obviously, people had different experiences. There was a lot of trauma, I know you're interested in trauma, but back then they had no such thing called
They had
PTSD.
no word, right? They didn't have a word
they
for
called
it.
it shell shock or lack of moral fiber, all these kind of designations which were shameful. I mean, we know about that also, like in World War II, that, there was one soldier who was shell shocked and Patton ended up punching him and he got in trouble with that because he was like, what kind of soldier are you? There was no understanding of those concepts. And so a lot of people who came back with that, and essentially, I mean, everybody had some form or another of trauma. I mean, they were exposed to unbelievable horrors over there. And so, yeah, they shut down, they moved on, and that's sort of like, and there was also the man thing, when you're a man, that's sort of how men in that generation dealt with things.
Well, so it's really fascinating to think about it because you're right, today's generation, especially the more modern, forget our generation, but the newer generation, everything's out. Social media, it's, they can talk about everything. And I think, as you mentioned, trauma, that really dealing with PTSD started in the 1980s. It's a very new idea. So many, many years after these people would have experienced this war. So, what surprised you most during this 10-year journey that you had with your grandfather and writing these stories?
A lot. I think the main thing, I guess, what surprised me was just sort of how widespread this was. Like for us, we grew up in an era where we thought it was so heroic, and we have these images we have in our mind. We've all seen movies and TV shows and conjured up in our imagination, read books. I at least have read a ton about World War II. But in the way it was experienced in people's lives, it had just such a profound effect on the way they went afterwards. And especially for the Jews, they had their own kind of angle. So I was surprised at how it made people much more connected to their identity, how it spurred a lot of them to come afterwards to Israel, either to move here or to just come and fight in the 48 War. But mostly I was struck by his insistence for so long to be just like, this is happened, it's over, I'm not looking back. And just that he made it such a sensitive thing triggered my curiosity even more, that eventually, and I don't want to give anything away from the book, but it doesn't really matter what each soldier individually did. They were all part of this huge effort that changed the world and gave us the world that we live in today. And so there was a profound sense of appreciation, I think.
And your grandmother, you mentioned he was in the uniform in the wedding picture, so she must have been involved at some point in the story. Did you speak to her too for this?
Yes, before. I mean, my grandparents passed away a few years ago. My grandfather made it to over the age of 100.
Wow.
So thankfully for him, he had a chance to, and he opened up the older he got, the more he opened up.
Maybe he didn't realize he was opening up so much.
My grandmother too, for years I tried to get to her, and she was a tough, Jewish matriarch. And she was like, leave him alone, doesn't want to talk about it, let it go, But of course, her life story is also explored in this book as well. She immigrated to Canada from Poland in the 1930s. Their family escaped before the Holocaust. So there was a direct link for her as well. And for him, I mean, I always, there were all these little clues around. Like in the house, I always had these pictures or all these images or things that he held. And like even the wedding picture I talk about, like, I was like, well, why'd you wear your uniform at your wedding? I mean, did you have to do it still? Was it a sign of patriotism? Was it sort of like this sense of showing that you're a soldier? And, he was a very funny guy. He was actually, and his response was, it's the only suit I had. That was sort of like, they didn't have a lot of money back then. So that's usually our interactions were like that. He was always sort of poo-pooing things aside. And it was very frustrating for a long time. But it feels very satisfying to know that we went on this journey together.
Yeah, it must be an incredible memory to have of your grandfather now and something you can give to the world, now that he's not here. Amazing. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that you're a journalist. You've been a journalist for a long time, worked with the Associated Press, and then in recent years, you've moved to do more technology writing. Did this sort of fill that void for you also a little bit, to be able to let you kind of bite into these stories when you're doing more, let's call it marketing writing or more promotional writing, I'm assuming, when you're working with the technology company?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thankful that my job in technology is actually a rare place where I do get to do storytelling, and I host a podcast there about technology, and I write about history and about innovations and profiles. So I do have the storytelling aspect in my day job. But yeah, I mean, this was sort of like where the passion was, and it also gave me a chance to really explore longer form storytelling, and especially since I'm not covering the daily beat anymore as I did when I was at the AP. And honestly, the last 2 years especially, it was connected, like we mentioned, but in many ways a sanctuary. It was a way for me to sort of like get away from what's going on in our day-to-day life and look back and give you a little bit different perspective, because we've all been going through unprecedented things the last 2 years and find yourself like, oh, this is what the world's falling apart kind of thing, and it's natural. But being able to sort of delve into history so deeply during this time has given me a little bit of a distance to sort of put it in a little more context.
Well, and I would guess also to give you a little bit more hope because, we've talked about World War II, as you mentioned, it's usually associated immediately with the Holocaust, from which the Jews, thank God, with all the 6 million that died, survived and have a thriving state of Israel. So I guess if we can get through that, we could get through this. So it must have been very meaningful in that sense as well.
Yes, there is that optimistic side. Of course, to everything there's a flip
Always
side.
have to have the optimistic side.
which is the fact that at least me, and I don't speak for others, but I have a sense that I speak kind of for my generation in ways that, World War II was always sort of like this. I always had this nostalgia to it in the sense that there was a clear good and bad. There was a good and evil. And since then, as we know, especially the media coverage of contemporary events, it's a very murky. Very rarely do we have like the clear good and bad. And in our case here in Israel, there's people who have completely flipped ideas about who the good guys and bad are. So there is something like the sense if we went back to World War II and that sort of set the world order. And we've been all enjoying the fruits of that for the last 80 years because there is something called a post-World War II order. And that, as we've seen in recent years, from every which direction is,
That's true.
I don't want to say crumbling, but it's shaken. And so looking back at World War II, it sort of also upended some of my assumptions. I always assumed, like, okay, it was the end of it and moved on. And always reality is more complicated than the way that we paint it. But there is a sense that we really need to preserve that which was fought and lost by so much in that war.
Do you think that we can ever go back to that reality of the good versus the evil and understanding who's who, or do you think the world actually has shifted?
Well, there's a lot of different, reasons for that. It's some of their political, orientations. A lot of it has to do with the technology and media and social media and all these things. And even back in World War II, I'm sure there were some people who were on the Nazi side. I don't know. I always wonder, like, what the media was like back then, like saying, this
well,
side,
obviously
that
the
side
Nazi
kind of
media,
thing.
because it
The
was
Nazi
controlled
media
by
was there,
by the Germans.
But today, I don't know. I've always been very wary throughout my career to compare anything to the Holocaust because I do think it's a singular event in human history. But it's not unique, the origins of it, in the sense of like what caused it. And therefore, even though I am very hesitant to compare anything, I would say that we are seeing the similar dynamics in the sense of anti-Semitism being normalized. And that I find very troubling, and that's something which I don't think my grandfather or any of his comrades would have imagined would be like 80 years later.
What do you think your grandfather would think of the book? Like, if he was alive now to read it as it came out, would he like it? Would he appreciate it?
I think he'd be very proud.
Okay.
I think he'd be very happy. I know that because the first stop in this journey was when in 2019 I published a long story in the New York Times Magazine about him and his friend Wilf Cantor, who was this pilot who fought in Israel's War of Independence and in World War II. He has a completely heroic story. And before that, I knew he was so hesitant, my grandfather, but eventually he was like, nobody wants to hear my story, nobody's interested in me. But then when it came out, he sort of showed interest, he printed it out, he showed it to people, he talked about them, and eventually he sort of gave a talk after he was 100 years old. He gave a talk about World War II and Remembrance Day in 2021. So I joke in the book that, like, it only took him 100 years, but he got there eventually.
It's incredible. It's really amazing. Now, tell me a little bit about balancing the acts of, a journalist, as you said, is impartial. And so here you're telling a personal story, which journalists tend not to do. So how did you balance that? Like, how did you learn to write a book like this when most of your career has been focused on being outside the story?
Well, in that sense, actually, it felt pretty natural because
Really?
I took the journalism skills and I just sort of like turned the camera around. It's almost like, thinking about, when you have your phone, you take a selfie. It was almost like that. It was a sense of, I still did all the research like I would as a journalist. I interviewed a lot of people. I tracked down World War II veterans. I went to museums. I read books. I did all these things that I would have done for a normal thing. But then there's also this retrospective on yourself too, and therefore I felt at the end I didn't have a choice, and I included myself in the story. And the story sort of tells itself as a journey between us and the parallels between us and all these things we're talking about. Whereas initially it was just like I want to do a profile of my grandfather, but it turned into really like an exploration of the legacy of that. 4 children, 9 grandkids, 14 great grandkids, and sort of like to see how the result of that war created the reality that we're all living in today.
Fascinating. So tell me something, regarding the issue of the silence. I want to go back for a minute. You spoke about the veterans that really returned home. They stayed silent. So with regards to that, do you feel that the memories are going to be accurate today? You know, as you were doing your research, did you feel that these people reflected what you were able to find in your other research? And how do we know that the stories, I mean, at 90 and 100 years old, are true?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, part of the, I guess, professional motivation was, like I said, I specialized at the Associated Press on reporting on Holocaust survivors. And that was sort of like a beat that I carved out for myself. And that was because I really felt that this is a mission of mine to get as many stories down as possible before they're all gone.
Do you feel like the Associated Press would let that kind of beat exist today? It's just so interesting, you know, so
I made it
that.
my own. I mean, I'm sure they still write significant stories, but for me, it was like I was there between 2005 and 2020.
Wow,
and during those 15
huge
years, I think I wrote more, at least according to Yad Vashem, I wrote more Holocaust stories than anyone else during those periods because I felt that was like, that's the window. I mean, they're just not around anymore.
Right.
And that touches on what you mentioned now about memory. A lot of people from the Holocaust and from World War II did not want to speak for a very long time.
Right.
Because it was either shame or taboo, or they wanted to move on, or it didn't reflect what people wanted to see. And in Israel, there was a sense of, let's talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And by the time it came around where it was acceptable for these people to tell their story, they were older. And so, like, my last stories was all about children. There's not a lot of, there weren't even in the last few years people who could tell all these stories. So it turned into like a second generation kind of storytelling. And now we're even essentially in the post-Survivor era. So you've got holograms and recordings, and Steven Spielberg has a huge archive, and there are all these things there. But there's nothing like talking to people in the flesh and seeing it and appreciating it. And so that was always my motivation, both with my work at AP and also with this book in particular. I said, I don't know what's going to happen. It was really a journey into the unknown, but I said, I will not forgive myself if I didn't try. And so that was pretty much the driving force. And whatever happens, happens. I don't want to look back one day and say I could have, should have, would have. But
you were trying to push to get some kind of museum here in Israel that would at least reflect some of the material that you've researched and the stories of these World War II veterans, the Jewish ones. And my understanding is that hasn't happened. People aren't into it. Why do you think there is hesitation to capture this and to make it a museum? And we have a Yad Vashem. I mean, obviously different, but we need to capture the story.
Well, first of all, it's interesting because this museum that you're mentioning, and I'll talk about it, sort of paralleled my own journey. I stumbled upon it in 2015.
Okay.
It's been in the works then over 10 years.
So somebody else wanted to do it.
Yeah, somebody else was doing it. They had it. They had a lot of bureaucratic issues. They couldn't find the funding. They couldn't get things going.
Okay.
There is a museum that exists. Okay. It's in Latrun, and it hasn't officially opened yet, but it's still, people are able to coordinate for specific visits over there, and that is the Museum of the Jewish Soldier in World War II. And there's a lot of reasons why it took so long for it to come around or what people were interested in. I think it's an important place to have because it is an accompanying to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem tells the story of the Holocaust. Right. And that, as I said, I acknowledge and appreciate and think is the leading narrative. But this other narrative has not been told. And so this, I think, is a balance to that. It tells you that, yes, the Jews suffered, they were victims, but they also fought everywhere and battled, and there's so many amazing stories of those people.
And you mentioned, though, that some of these soldiers also faced anti-Semitism while fighting with the Allies. So tell me a little bit about what you discovered there. Was it very different than what we were seeing, I'm assuming, in anti-Semitism than today, or similar?
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather, they grew up in the time where anti-Semitism was like more culturally acceptable in the sense of like, today it's weird. Today we have, all these words you're not allowed to use and everybody's politically correct, but there's an underlying, I feel like, the anti-Semitism comes out in different ways. Right. Back then it was, slurs, it was quotas, it was stereotypes, it was, the way you were regarded. You weren't allowed to join, golf clubs or gyms. And like even Toronto, I tell a bit of the stories over there, how, they couldn't go to certain hospitals. They had to open up their own hospital. But my grandfather, he sort of tells it sort of like as, by the way, I mean, so one of his best friends was like an anti-Semite. He was like, he didn't even know why he called it. It sounds ridiculous to say, but it feels like it was more like, naive anti-Semitism. Like I'm sure there were the diehard racists that were out there. But generally, I mean, even he said that in World War II, there was sometimes quote unquote positive anti-Semitism in the sense that it was like stereotypes. Like my grandfather was a navigator. Okay. Why was he a navigator? Because they tended to put Jews as navigators. They assumed Jews were smarter. And they'd know where they were going, and they were good at math. And my grandfather said, I was no good at math, but they just thought I was, so I went into the navigator track. So there's all these kind of like things which today would be considered not PC. Oh, you can't assume that. But in many ways, some of the stuff we see today is even more nefarious in that way.
It's so interesting, and I guess Yeah, I mean, the traditional things like the Jews have horns or, like you said, we're good at money. I guess that's what's become covert
And it
today.
was different in different places. Like in World War
Yeah.
II, a lot of them went to the Air Force. The Air Force was a place there were higher numbers because it was more integrated, and
Okay.
the infantry was worse. And the worst was the Navy in Canada, for example. The Navy was just took on this. There were very few Jews who were over there, and I interviewed one of those guys who was in the Navy, and I heard his story about who went over there and people were just making fun of him all the time and harassing him all the way until finally he punched a guy back, and then they became friends. It was like it was different times. It was
Yeah. Did you do any looking into what happened in the rest of North America, like the United States, while you were looking into what happened in Canada? And were they very similar?
Yes. Well, the United States had the biggest fighting force in World War
Okay.
II. There were 550,000 Jews who fought in the American army.
Oh, wow.
Those are 200,000 in the Red Army, the Soviet army. That, by the way, was the bloodiest front. If you're talking about 500,000 Jews who served, of them, 200,000 died. So we're talking about 40% dead. The casualty rate was lower in the West because the real trench war was on the Eastern Front. But yeah, the Americans, they came into war obviously later, and they were involved more in the Pacific Front. But there is a very unique Jewish experience to especially the liberation of Europe, and a lot of these Jews ended up liberating concentration camps, and they were the first people there who were to greet the Jews who were emaciated, and they welcomed them with the word of Yiddish. And there was all these stories about how, for them, that's when they realized why they're doing it. They had this extra motivating factor that was pushing them.
That's super beautiful. And tell me about lessons in resilience. I mean, now that you've finished the book, it's on the shelves, you're going to debut it soon, and you said the Toronto and go on a speaking tour. So if you have to leave people the message, what of a resilience from all of this World War II story of these soldiers, what would that be? How can it help us today to be stronger?
Well, I think, just understanding that it's never been easy. It's never been easy to be Jewish. It's never been easy to be Zionist. There's always going to be struggles. I think I naively might have thought at one point that we've reached as they say in Hebrew, the menucha v'nachala, the promised land. Things are going to be calm from here on in. We've been slapped out of that illusion. It's there, but we can look back and say that we have a long history behind us, whether World War II and hundreds of thousands of years before that as well. And so for me, these seem like something that could really be a reminder in our times today whenever we find ourselves in oh, wow, there's no way out of this kind of thing, that there's a way out. It's not going to be easy, but there's a way.
So we're going to end with this. Pretend I'm your grandfather.
Okay.
Sitting here talking to your grandfather. He's alive again today. And you've got the book on the table, which will hopefully, be able to show some people the covers and how to order it after we complete the podcast. But talking to your Zaidy, you want to tell him something about the book, what it meant to you to do it. What would you say to him?
I would thank him for speaking to me, for letting down his guard a little bit, for introducing me to the other characters who made up this book, and for allowing me to fulfill this dream that I always had of being able to tell this family story that's reflective and I feel missing from the general narrative. And I will tell him that I really appreciate that he allowed me to do that, and I hope that he appreciates what I've done for him, which is to leave this a memory of him that will live on.
Amazing. Well, Aron Heller, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.